Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the U.S. Consulate General Istanbul, I would like to welcome you to this panel discussion, Teaching Through a Global Pandemic, Turkish and American Perspectives on Challenges and Successes. Tonight's event will be focused on the discussion among our panelists, and therefore we will not be having a live Q&A session. However, we would like to invite you to ask questions in the Q&A box, and these will be copied and considered in our next event on June 5th, which will bring teachers from both Turkey and the US together to discuss their experiences of teaching during the pandemic and to share the strategies and practices they developed to face the many challenges of this year. So please, if you have questions, do write them. In addition, if you are an English-speaking Turkish or an American K-12 teacher interested in joining that roundtable discussion, we will provide a link in the chat box where you can register your interest. Before we begin, I would like to take this moment to honor the memory of my colleague, Dilek Bıçakçı, who was at the center of planning this event, as well as the roundtable conversation event that will follow on June 5th. Dilek passed away unexpectedly on May 7th. Those of you who met Dilek would agree that she was known for her warmth, her light, her singular character, and you also know how impossible it feels to express this loss. But for those who are just knowing her now, Dilek was passionate about education, about uplifting youth and supporting teachers. Having worked on educational programming in the public affairs section of the US Consulate for 37 years, Dilek's impact on the education sector was wide and deep. Her warmth and wisdom touched many educators and students' lives as she advocated strongly for programs and organizations that support youth, teachers, and learning, and created opportunities for intercultural learning and professional growth for many educators and students alike. Indeed, her passing signifies a tremendous loss for the field of education. In this moment, though, as we turn our attention to the educators gathered here for this event, I hope that we focus on what the field of education, what all of us who knew her gained through the grace of Dilek's presence and passion. She was a gift. Dilek cared deeply about leaving the world a better place for the next generation, and I can say with certainty that she succeeded. This event is dedicated to her. I would like now to turn it over to Dave Panetti, Cultural Attaché at the U.S. Consulate General Istanbul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. My name is Dave Panetti, and I serve as the Cultural Attaché for the U.S. Consulate General here in Istanbul. While I now work as a diplomat, I started my professional life teaching high school geography, history, and civics for nearly 20 years. The subject of education is very near and dear to my heart. And as you all know, once a teacher, always a teacher, no matter what path life takes you on in later years. Of course, the field of education has been deeply impacted by the last extraordinary 18 months. The pandemic has both created new challenges for teachers, administrators, and students, and exacerbated pre-existing inequities and ordeals for us all. Education has always been an important issue for the U.S. mission here in Turkey. We've worked extensively with many stakeholders in the field and firmly believe that education acts as the proverbial gümüşmeri, or silver bullet, for many of the problems that plague all societies. This focus is even more meaningful today with the coming of May 19th, tomorrow, the commemoration of Atatürk Youth and Sports celebrations here in Turkey. Our team at the U.S. Consulate General has frequently been in touch with our partners in the field, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize and thank them for their continued cooperation. ERG, the Education Reform Initiative, ORAV, the Teachers Academy, and Öğretmen Ağı, the Teachers Network. In addition, I'd like to thank our colleagues from the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, whose critical mission is to increase mutual understanding between the American people and the people of other countries through educational and cultural exchanges. Thank you, one and all. As a result of our work together, we've had the unique opportunity to focus closely on how education professionals in both Turkey and the United States have dealt with the huge challenges of this new reality of virtual education. It's remarkable to see how teachers around the world have adapted and reinvented both themselves and education in the face of teaching during a pandemic. But we have also seen how the pandemic has accentuated the grave problems related to educational equity and access on a global scale. These problem areas have taken a great toll on teachers, students, and families the world over. I have no doubt that teachers have been leading the way during this troubled period, right alongside healthcare providers. I think we can all agree that it's possible to use this terrible episode as an opportunity to connect across nations over a shared common experience, that of teaching during a truly global crisis. Together with our partners, we have therefore decided to embark on this series of virtual discussions. Our goal is for Turkish and American teachers to be able to share their experiences, to recognize that they are not alone in the challenges that they face, and also to learn from each other as they share ways in which they have confronted and overcome various difficulties throughout this tumultuous year. Just as importantly, we hope to create the possibility for further international collaboration among teachers as we move forward into a brighter future. Before closing, I'd like to say just a few words about our colleague Dilek. As Andrea so ably noted, Dilek was a bright light for many, and she was passionate about education. Upon first meeting a new student, teachers will often share how they can tell within minutes, seconds even, whether that student has the fire, the spark of curiosity and hunger that drives a person to learn. As a former teacher, I recognized immediately that Dilek shared that fire. And together, with an ever-present twinkle in her eye and guided by her desire for only the best outcomes for teachers and students, she worked tirelessly for decades to support the United States mission that helped both her homeland and mine. She will be sorely missed. We thank our panelists for their valuable time this evening and for the insights that you bring. And we thank you all for joining us in this panel discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Fulden Eren. Fulden has long been interested in international politics, and she studied international relations at Middle East Technical University. She developed curiosity in other areas of social sciences during her undergraduate studies and completed a minor in the logic and philosophy program. To expand her knowledge, she studied political science at Philipps University in Marburg, Germany, as part of the Erasmus program. Her interest in social causes and justice led Fulden to advocate for various organizations in the fields of gender and human rights, social memory, and digital communication. Accordingly, she decided to continue her professional career in civil society and started working at Checks and Balances Network as digital communications coordinator in 2013. To develop her knowledge and specialize in digital communications, she moved to Sweden for her master's studies. She completed the Digital Media and Society Graduate Program at Uppsala University in 2018. Currently, she is the Communications Coordinator at Teachers Network. Thank you very much, Fulden. I now leave it to you.
Thank you, Andrea. As Mr. Panetti addressed, we are living through the pandemic regardless of limits and national boundaries. Spaces as today's panel, where we can hear different perspectives from around the globe, helps us make sense of our own experiences. I hope we will all leave this panel with a greater sense of solidarity across borders. And we are gathered here today to talk about how we, as educators, experienced the pandemic and overcame the immense challenges we have been facing. But before we dive into the panel discussions, I would like to turn to our distinguished panelists and ask them to briefly introduce themselves. Firstly, I want to welcome Professor Kenan Çayır from İstanbul University, Sociology Department, who is also a consultant at Teachers Network, where we work together very closely. Mr. Çayır, welcome.
Thank you, Fulden. I am teaching sociology at İstanbul University for more than 20 years. And I'm also directing a Center for Sociology and Education Studies, where we work with teachers and different stakeholders. And we develop some background papers and lesson modules in order to handle controversial issues in education. And as you said, I also enjoy very much working with teachers and different stakeholders in Teachers Network.
Thank you. We also have Professor Selçuk Şirin from New York University, Department of Applied Psychology with us. Mr. Şirin, welcome.
Thank you. I want to start with paying my respect for Dilek, with whom we've been communicating for over 2 years. Unfortunately, the event that we planned just was around March of last year. So, I never met her, but we have emailed back and forth over the years, and I know how tirelessly she worked for this event and other projects. It's just unbelievable. I am a researcher here, a professor here at NYU, New York University. I study marginalized youth from early childhood to adolescence and young adulthood. I am a developmental and educational psychologist by training, and my research primarily focuses on immigrant youth, refugees, Muslim Americans in terms of their adaptation, development here in the US. I also study refugees in Europe, particularly in Norway and Turkey. I did one of the first field studies on Syrian refugees in Turkey. And as some of you may know, I also have a project in Turkey to distribute 1 million free books to children who are in need at birth. Hopefully we will have some time to talk about that, why I'm doing that. That is who I am. Thank you.
We are as well joined by Joelle Mcintosh, who is a career and technical educator from Missouri, USA. Welcome, Joelle.
Thank you, Fulden. And I'd like to say thank you to the U.S. Consulate for inviting me today. I am Joelle Mcintosh from the United States. I am from St. Louis, Missouri, in the middle of the United States. I am a 20-year career and technical educator where I teach business classes as well as personal finance courses to students in secondary education and high school here in the United States. Thank you so much for having me this evening.
And thank you. Last but not least, I'd like to welcome Ijan Kavaklar from Mersin, Turkey, who is an ICT teacher as well as trainer at Teachers Academy Foundation.
Good evening, everyone. First, thank you for having me here. It's a great honor to be here with you. My name is Ijan Kavaklar, and I'm an ICT teacher in Mersin. I've been teaching for 15 years. Since 2019, I've been working in Research and Development Department of the Mersin Provincial Directorate of National Education, in the team responsible for local and national projects and trainings for the teachers and students. I give trainings in the fields of robotics, STEM, and coding at our project coordination and learning center. Also, I'm one of the teacher trainers of the Teachers Academy Foundation. Now I give online courses and webinars on the eCampus platform of our foundation. And in addition to these, I'm working as a Europe Code Week leading teacher and ambassador of Scientix project, which promotes and supports collaboration with among STEM educators. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let's proceed to the panel discussion. I'd like to start with Professor Çayır. Mr. Çayır, we have all witnessed that the already existing inequalities deepened and access to education declined sharply during the pandemic. This unfortunately puts us further away from ensuring inclusive education. And I want to ask you, To what extent were the education systems ready for a crisis at this scale? And how did different systems work to address the problems we have been facing since the start of the pandemic?
Yes, very important, extensive questions, but I have limited time, I know. I'll try to do my best. I mean, were we ready for such an unprecedented crisis challenge? I think we were not. We were, discussing the climate crisis. We were discussing some air pollution, economic crisis, but really we were not ready. I mean, education systems, I mean, was not ready for such a crisis. We have some, I remember my school days, some, earthquake drills, fire drills. So we know how to evacuate the building, in a possible earthquake, but we were not ready, in a full lockdown, fully, online education. And we forgot the memory. I sometimes think we forgot the memory of Spanish flu. I mean, yeah, conditions were different, totally different. It was 100 years ago, but we forgot that memory. That's, I think, important. So how did different actors, different systems, responded to this crisis, to this pandemic? I will briefly go through the ministry's response and teachers and what we did in Teachers Network. With teachers, we are working with Teachers Network. When schools closed down, by the way, nowadays they are also closed, except 8th graders and 12th graders who will take national exams and kindergarten. They are still closed in Turkey. Education in Turkey mostly relied on distance education. And we have 18 million students from kindergarten to 12th grade, 18 million. The one option for the students was to follow the courses on in Turkish EBA, Education Information Network. This is a TV online education platform via TV. And we can consider it is the most accessible, channel. But according to ministry statistics, 7 million students actively used this platform out of 18 million students. Okay. The other channel was online education, online courses facilitated by teachers. And for a short period, schools were open on a rotation basis in Turkey. So when, in your question, your first sentence was inequalities deepened in this pandemic, in this crisis. Yes, that's an important statement. This online teaching widened the gap between upper class, families and lower class families in the Turkish context. Why I'm saying this? Because when we when we are talking about remote education, access to digital devices, is very important, as we all know. And we all know in Turkey that they are not equally distributed, digital devices, access to digital devices. I have few figures. For instance, prior to pandemic, this is from the PISA research 2018, 67% of students in Turkey reported that they have a computer they use for education, 67%. That means more than 30% did not have a computer, during the pandemic. And an education teachers union report says that 30% of the students cannot reach to online education due to the lack of resources. Okay, And many of the students joined online courses via mobile phone, and Ijan perhaps can tell us how effective, I mean, could it be, participating via, mobile phone. And one last figure, the disparity between the private schools and the public schools in Turkey. Again, research shows that the percent of students who say that I regularly attend online courses in private schools, 83%. 83% of students say that in private school, they regularly attend courses. But this is only 36 in public schools. Yeah, there is a huge difference between, private schools and public schools regarding regular attendance to courses. So, I mean, these figures show us that, there is, Turkish society is already characterized by regional disparities and unequal income distribution, for a long period, and it has specific challenges, as Professor Shirin said. I mean, Turkey hosts the largest refugee population. I mean, and it happened in the last, 6 and 7 years, 4 million. 5% of the population is, added to the Turkish society. This is a specific challenge for Turkish society. So I'm, giving the context in order to understand how large the disparities, between different, the hosting groups, the refugees, and the East Turkey and the Western Turkey, and upper class families and lower class families. So, Fulden, you're right. I mean, the pandemic unfortunately deepened, widened the gap, educational gap, between different high status and low status groups. One other important topic, I guess, is parents' role. We all know that in remote education, parents play key role as motivators and as facilitators for online education. And of course, I mean, educated families, high socioeconomic families, group families are advantages on this respect. And I know that they develop some strategies, certain strategies. Last 2 minutes, okay. So I know, for instance, some families rented, schools were closed, but they rented some private office spaces for, where they had education, with private tutoring, etc. Okay. This was another, problem that widened the educational gap. Success stories, lastly, teachers, many teachers did amazing job. In this, in the last, year during the pandemic. In Teachers Network, where we work together. Teachers Network, by the way, is a network that brings together teachers and different stakeholders. We collectively produce and reflect on problems. Teachers Network work with an ethnocratic mentality, not bureaucratic, but ethnocratic. That means we have more than 400 change agent teachers in 40 different cities. And they can form, on the basis of their needs, they can make a group, ethnocratic group on their needs. So, for instance, one group was formed by a few teachers, and they said, okay, I know how to teach, how to write and read to first graders, but I don't know how to do it online. So they formed an ethnocratic groups, and the facilitators in Teachers Network, we help them to meet with different stakeholders, academics, etc. One other group, for instance, was the group of school counselors. They are teachers in the Turkish context. And they came together and they produced a toolkit, adaptation to school toolkit, and they disseminated these toolkits to different the colleagues throughout Turkey. So I think this is an unprecedented crisis, and this requires flexible solutions. One problem in Turkey is that for the US context, we don't have states. We have just one state, and with a very centralized decision-making mechanisms. But unfortunately, this crisis requires flexible and localized solutions. That's why I'm telling the Teachers Network and Ethocratic Mentality, they did amazing job with this ethocratic mentality. And I hope we will, with this series, with this collaboration with the US Embassy, we will develop our network with friends from the US context. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Chayir. As you have said, there is the gap widened greatly due to economical, political, social, and technological conditions in Turkey. Yet, as you addressed, teachers' efforts made great change in filling this gap widened during the pandemic. And although it is better off at private schools where students can access education, we should always aim 100% when it comes to education. So thank you again for your comments and remarks. I'd like to proceed to Professor Selçuk Şirin. I'd like to ask Mr. Şirin, what are the similarities and differences between the American and Turkish education systems in terms of their agility and responsiveness to crisis? And how were the educational stakeholders affected from the interruptions to access to education? We'd like to hear your comments.
Sure, I think Professor Chayir alluded to it. The main difference is the centralized decision-making process in Turkey versus very decentralized decision-making in the US, which, I mean, both of these approaches have advantages and disadvantages. So if you know the answer or solution, if you are 100% sure, Turkish system is great. You just make a decision in Ankara and all of a sudden 20 million kids and their parents and the whole system works smoothly. But if you make mistakes, or more generally, if you don't have the answers right away, if you don't do the planning, then you have a mess. In the US, the states are considered laboratories, right? Each state has their own option, and within each state, like I live in New Jersey, there are 450 ministries of education, if you will, school districts. So each one of them has a unique approach. And any one of them may come up with the right approach, and then others can follow or use it as a best practice. So that is the beauty of the US system, where there is decentralized decision-making, more local control, and if one of the local districts have the right approach, then others may follow. It is good to identify solutions, but once you have the solutions, then the system in the US is very difficult to move, because you then have to get all the stakeholders in each small district. Just to give you an example, where I live in New Jersey, our kids never been to school since March 10 of last year. Next town over, we have another town, and they have been in school for the most part. So these are both happening in the same context, and you may ask yourself, what's happening? They are looking at the same data points, coming up with different options. But this is a larger conversation. What I would hope that we find the middle ground between these two extreme cases, where you don't really need to have 450 different solutions in a state like New Jersey, but at the same time, you don't really give the power to one person in Ankara to make a decision for 20 million people, right, or students. As we have seen in Turkey, for example, the village schools or remote, sparsely populated schools, why are they being shut down when you are making a decision based on Ankara or Istanbul schools? That makes no sense. given that it's a larger conversation, I'm going to stop there. I want to focus on the other part of your question. I think there are best practices in the US. Many school districts are doing amazing work in terms of access, in terms of addressing some of the problems, the gaps that we talked about earlier. Just to summarize where those gaps come from, in the US or in Turkey, pretty much, it either comes from preschool, the gaps between different populations or student groups. It either comes from preschool, access to having resourceful home environments, as well as preschool, kindergarten in particular, or 2 years of schooling, we know is the best remedy for addressing this kind of social class or socioeconomic status differences in early school. The other variance that we can see, or the other factor that contribute to the gaps in educational outcomes, come from after schools, like what kids do, not in school, but after school. And most importantly, summer learning loss is the term we use in the literature, but you can also think of it as any time kids spend after school, right? Unfortunately, during the pandemic, that after school period expanded, right? Like I said, in some schools, it's been a year that kids never been to school. So what happens then, the differences, by the way, my dissertation is about social class effects on school outcomes. It's a meta-analysis. If any one of you interested, you should check it out. So in that meta-analysis, we identify some of the factors, like the achievement gap in the US is most widely studied between Blacks and others, Black students and others, but in most recent years, we are also studying it with English learners and others. And those gaps, if you look at over the years where it comes from, it's mostly coming from either historical inequalities in school districts where the funding is more local here, the zip code, and really determines the kind of schooling you have, but also the resources that are available at home from birth. Now, when you are looking at the ingredients of academic performance, like where it comes from, some of the, if you think of it as an equation, it's the left side where we have the set of predictors. There we are finding that socioeconomic status effects are set in the first 6 years. And we know that from the brain development as well, right? The early years, whatever we are studying as a developmental psychologist, I can tell you that give me any topic and I can say that, oh, the most recent research suggests that it actually starts earlier. Like that's the main finding in everything. Whatever you're thinking, oh, it's not 4 years, it's 3 years. No, it's not 3 years, it's 2 years. And it goes all the way to prenatal development. And even before that, you have to make sure that mothers are, well fed and well taken care of during their pregnancy. Now, all those effects are really social class effects. So during the pandemic, when you close the schools, especially in preschool, you are really limiting access. And Jim Heckman has a great work on this. He won the Nobel Prize in economics for this work to identify where we can invest in a child's life from birth to age 30 and what's the rate of return. And he has also shown that it's the preschool years. And if you're a 5-year-old coming from low-income background, either in Turkey or in the US, this is universal. You have just lost 2 school years of remedy that is essential for your success. So school readiness gap is really the question we should address. School readiness is when they start school first grade, the difference between those 2 groups. And then after school effect is multiplied. If you, do I have time? Maybe 1 more minute, Fulden?
Yes, you have a bit more than a minute.
Oh, perfect. So I also want to address the future, like where I see how it's going to work out. If you asked me this question at the beginning of the pandemic, I was so optimistic. I was like, here we have an amazing historical opportunity to really revamp the education. All the reforms that we talk about and never did, because we really know what to do, by the way. I mean, if you look at the literature, the solutions are very clear, like early school, right? Give school universal pre-kindergarten to every kid. That's the best thing you could do. We know this for years now. It's nothing new. We know that executive functioning skills are teachable, very easy to adopt, early school, etc. We know all the solutions. So why aren't we doing it? Because we are, we have the kind of decision-making processes both here and in Turkey that are very politicized. We have inequalities in terms of school bonding, etc. So when the pandemic started, COVID-19 here, I thought this was a historical opportunity. We have the school system that hasn't changed much over the last 2 centuries, and we are going to really get to start from fresh. And if we do that, then we have an opportunity to really address a lot of the problems that we couldn't. But now, after 1 year, I am not as optimistic. I think we are, and I should know this again as a psychologist, we are very conservative, right? We don't really change our behavior unless we are forced, and we do that, especially adults, for a very short period of time until we get the next opportunity to go back to our status quo. But I am hopeful for young people, for this generation, COVID-19 generation, kids who haven't been to schools or haven't played with their peers. I am hopeful that their political attitudes will address some of these issues in a more agile way. So if they did, here's what I think over the next generation of schooling. I think the way we have really built school buildings have to change, because the classroom, putting 25 or 30, or in Turkey some places 45 kids at age 6 in the same room makes no sense, because the younger you go, there is more variation between students. You can have 20 15-year-olds in a classroom, more or less you can teach them the same subject, because the variation on any given topic in terms of their skill level will be limited. But if you have 26-year-olds, you have huge variation. We just talk about early school differences, the kinds of places where they grew up, the kinds of experiences they were exposed to, etc. So it makes no sense for us to really have classroom, quote unquote, based on biological age. So we have to move away from that. Number two, we really have to deal with this teaching profession and what we are doing as teachers. For the most part, I grew up in a village in Turkey, remote village. Dave, your background picture seems like from my village in Kars. Beautiful this time around. I grew up there until age 18. Schools for us was the place where it was like enlightenment, right? You go, you get knowledge, right? We didn't have Google, so you would go to school to understand very basic things about life. Well, we no longer need that. You can get the information, quote unquote, or data, or basic, the encyclopedia of the enlightenment from Google, from internet. So why are we trying to use schools as a place where we transform knowledge? You can get that from many different places. So going forward, I think we will have teachers as content producers, YouTubers, or any kind of platform you can think of where they can create their content for everyone. I teach statistics here. I teach ANOVA for the last 20 years. I have 30 students here. Why should I be the one teaching ANOVA to only 30 students here? If I'm really good, I should be teaching this to anyone, anywhere. Or my students are, forced to take my class. Maybe I'm not the best teacher. Maybe, Ijan is going to teach this way better than me, more entertaining. So they should go online, get it from Ijan. But the problem is, who's going to encourage them? Who's going to motivate them, right? The content is everywhere. If anyone with kids would know this, all the teachers would know this. Content is there. Why should they be going to take those classes or getting that content? So we need teachers, and majority of teachers has to really have a good background on why people care, why people learn, motivation. And this is not really part of our teacher training programs as much as it should be. Going forward, if you have to pick a number, I think 80% of teachers will be motivators, like coaches, like cheerleaders. Like, you can do this. This is where you get the knowledge, but this is how you can make it more personal. It's meaningful. This is the reason why you should care, etc. Why should you learn statistics, for example, or ANOVA, as we were using? And maybe another 5, 10, 15, up to 20% will be the content providers. And I think that we will see that change going forward. And the building, school buildings has to be more mobile, more fluid, you know, maybe a small groups here, 3, 5, 10, learning a subject here, another group there, and they can be moved around with teachers moving around, working in teams, etc. I don't think I have more time to go into this, but I have a YouTube channel in Turkish. You can always go check that out. And before I go, I have to put this in the chat box. I am putting the web page for you to check out the project I mentioned earlier to address the gaps at birth so that every child has the vocabulary that they need when they get to school to understand what teachers are saying, also to express themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shirin. Your expertise and transcultural experience sheds lights on our understanding of systemic challenges and helps us make sense of our experience. I as well take this lesson, and I can say that agility is not a concept only, is not necessary only when we discuss education systems, but we also need agility for ourselves as educators and be more responsive. And if I have to go back to Kenan Çayır's statements, edocracy, not bureaucracy, is something we will need more and more as we proceed these times and hopefully overcome the pandemic. Thank you again. And as you all know well, the pandemic underlined the importance of teaching as a profession and its transformative potential, as Mr. Shirin said. We saw that teachers' creative confidence and their initiatives created successful learning experiences for the students and their parents. I would like to start with Joelle Mcintosh from St. Louis and ask, even if you could reach to your students, it must have taken a lot of effort to keep your students engaged. So how did the pandemic alter your educational practices? What were your tactics and strategies overcoming these challenges? Let's hear you, Joelle.
So thank you. I wanted to just, Professor Sharon shared a couple of statistics about New Jersey. I am in Missouri, which is in the middle of the United States. And in Missouri, we have 226 school districts. And what he shared was that Turkey was one state with a central government that made decisions across the board for everyone. And yes, in the United States, we are smaller states. And within each state, the decision-making about education, or is pretty much about everything, is made within smaller municipalities or smaller communities. So when the pandemic, when we were told in the middle of March to pack our things and go home, the initial thinking was that this would be a short stay. We would be home for maybe 2-3 weeks, at the longest a month. We never saw it extending well into our summer and into our fall. So initially, I agree with Professor Sharon. I thought this would be a great time to really re-envision what the possibilities of education would look like. And I sat at home excited, waiting to hear some communication from either our national government, our state level government, and at the very least from my school district. It didn't come. It took a very, what I considered a great amount of time to hear from our district leadership to say what our next steps should be. While we had internet available, many of our students, like students in Turkey, did not have the devices available, did not have the internet infrastructure, the ability to access the technology that they needed to meet with teachers. So we had creative teachers that met. One solution our district provided was they put what we call a hotspot, or a mobile digital web access, on a bus. And they put buses in every school in our district, and students could come to sit in the parking lot and access school there, whether they walked with their computers or they sat in cars or they used their phones. That was one creative solution. We also had teachers that developed toolkits where they made copies of papers and delivered them to schools, to students. Personally, I worked from home, and instead of thinking about curriculum as lessons, I worked more towards projects. And so I wanted students to understand how the academic content connected with what we considered real life. And I felt that in this moment, what a great opportunity for students to have voice in what education might look like in the future. So I challenged them to think about what they were experiencing, what they felt like they needed, what they felt was invaluable, and then how would they translate that into what an educational system might look like. I challenged them to think about if the purpose and the objective of education is to create the next generation of business leaders and problem solvers, how do we do that given our current constraints? Because at that point in time, we just didn't know when this might be over. I felt that was the most valuable way to reach students, to challenge them to think about, we started with education, but then I challenged them to think about the pivots or changes that businesses also had to make in an effort to remain viable. So businesses are in place to provide goods and services to their consumer, and they also in some way would like to earn a profit. And so what things that they have to recognize or challenges that they have to see that their consumer was facing during this time, and what was the best way to embrace that? Of course, we utilize technology in all of the ways possible. My particular district uses Google Classroom, so we implemented all of the tools that Google offered. I met students, we would meet on cell phones, Google Chat. I also used YouTube videos. I found ways to bring that. I also brought the voices of students around the globe to the classroom so that they began to understand that this wasn't just a US situation. This was impacting every student, every community around the world. And I wanted them to see the value in that. Even as we march toward the end of our school year, one thing I've highly encouraged students to do is sit down and journal and think about what was your experience? What were the good, the bad, the challenges that they face? I also encourage them to be proud of themselves that they persevered during this time, whether they met the same level of success they were used to, you made it. And you made it together. And this will be something that you will be able to sit down and tell your children about. I mean, the last time we've had a world event at this type of magnitude is perhaps the Spanish flu. And so this is a time where they are truly a part of history. As you guys know from a global lens, lots of things happened in our country in this last year that also played a huge role in education, that played a role in the way students felt about themselves, the way they felt about their community, the way they felt about politics. And those things cannot be extrapolated away from their educational experiences. It all synthesized and worked together. So I really challenge them to think about all of these things and not see academics or schools siloed away from everything else. They really needed to see how they all work together. And it is now their challenge and their task going forward to think about, how do we do things differently? How do we look at things differently and plan for a different future that's inclusive of not just our United States citizens, but globally, our global citizens?
Thank you, Joelle. What I hear from you is that access to education goes beyond access to schools, because the pandemic taught us education is not peculiar to school environments. So as I heard from you, teachers did incredible job for children to get education even beyond schools. And I also want to highlight what you have said, that we need to re-envision, rethink education as well as the resources we use for education. It was a valuable comment. Thank you for the speech.
Thank you.
As Joelle reminded, we came across hundreds, even thousands of creative solutions to problems faced in education during the pandemic. We witnessed that teachers network, some teachers use WhatsApp to tell stories while not getting caught up to internet quotas. Some opened their own YouTube channels, maybe Mr. Shirin would be interested in them. And some wandered around the city by foot and saw their children in person, as well as preserving their physical distance so that children could have the motivation. So we know we have a lot to learn from teachers' experiences. And now I would like to give the floor to Ijan Kavaklar and ask her, how was your experiences as a teacher and as a civil society volunteer during the pandemic? And how did your daily routines change? And how could you overcome the issues you faced?
Thank you, Fulden. The pandemic has changed not everything, but so many things about teaching and learning. Teachers were perhaps the most working and struggling ones after the healthcare professionals. Before the pandemic, I was teaching my classes in my computer lab at my school. I teach computer literacy, robotics, and coding. Besides, we were doing extracurricular STEM and coding projects with my students. And we were dancing, playing games, doing hands-on activities, even organizing educational mobilities to abroad. Those were the days. When schools were shut down suddenly due to pandemic, we had very little time to prepare for remote learning. Like Professor Chayir said, we weren't ready at all. I was one of the luckiest because I'm an ICT teacher, and it's easy for me to adapt to new technologies or new tools, but still I had to reconsider my pedagogical approach, and I needed to adapt my practices and be creative to keep students engaged. Teaching virtually was a lot more work than actually teaching in class. With the pandemic and remote learning, our roles as facilitators and designers came forward more than as instructors. In addition, we had to improve our skills, like Professor Shirin said, such as resilience or agility. During this period, I came together with my students on online platforms only for projects. But it happened with a limited number of students due to access problems. Even this made me feel good because I miss my students. My school is in a very disadvantaged area in Mersin. A high percentage of my students in poverty have not computers and a reliable internet connection at home. Most of them had to access less live lessons or online resources from their parents or older brothers or sisters' mobile phones. Attendance was a big issue, and we couldn't force them to participate under those circumstances. I stress over how to maintain their learning and get them to grow academically when they weren't coming to class consistently. And also, some parents required a translator to learn how to access Zoom or Google Classroom. I helped them to learn technology and strategies to support their children at home. So I went through each assignment and videotaped myself doing it, showing them how to do, and sent them via WhatsApp. And also I took part in the Role Model Teachers program of a non-governmental organization. So I was able to deliver science kits, some kind of robotic kits, to a limited number of students in my school. And I guided them online and on the phone to do projects at home using those kits. On the other hand, as a teacher, I had to consider not only academic, but also the physical and social emotional needs of my students. I've been thinking about what I can do to reduce transactional distance. Dialogue was the key. When students entered the virtual lessons, I engaged in casual conversations, asking about their weekend, what's ahead in the week, how they're doing, and so on. But there was a situation that I had to put the oxygen mask on myself first. I was so tired. I working from early morning till midnight in front of the computer screen, and I had to fulfill my responsibilities while living my fears and anxieties. Teachers' well-being was one of the most important things that stood out during this time. And thanks to Teachers Academy Foundation, I attended coaching sessions. Talking to my coach had a great impact on my well-being. We worked with her on time management, communication, anxiety management, and self-compassion. And after that, I felt really better, and I had enough motivation to move on. Besides all these, I've been working as a teacher trainer more than a secondary school teacher during pandemic. We took the responsibility of education, not only for my students, but also for the students and teachers in my city, even in Turkey, thanks to the organizations we collaborate with, such as Teachers Academy Foundation and Teachers Network. Because a significant number of teachers faced online tools and programs for the first time, and they were struggling to use them. So I gave online trainings on virtual applications, Web2 tools, designing online lessons, and so on. And as a project coordinator in Mersin, we organized online webinars, competitions for students and teachers. We published online documents about activities and games which they can do at home with their families, book and movie recommendations. Also, we shared educational videos, stories told by the teachers, and the recordings of our webinars on our official YouTube channel. One motivator for us is the opportunity to collaborate with other experts and colleagues. Virtual platforms can help us learn from peers, share lesson plans, innovative and best practices, and engage in a professional community. Thank you.
Thank you. What I hear from you is that teachers did not only adapt themselves, but also their students and their parents and their colleagues in this environment. So teacher well-being is really, really important. And thank you for bringing up. Also, maybe we can later share all the resources you have mentioned during the panel with the attendees, so we can have a transcultural list of best practices. I think it would be beneficial for all of us.
Sure.
We are almost finishing, but I'd like to turn to our panelists for the last time and ask for your final remarks on today's discussion and reflect on what you have heard from other panelists, and share your projections for the future of education. Can you please have a couple of sentences and share your comments? Mr. Çayır.
Yes, we are going through a real challenge. Students, not only students, and all citizens in all countries feel unsafe and weak, okay? Not only because of the pandemic, but because of, these rapidly changing worlds, neoliberal world, etc., etc. We have to underline again and again that education is a political activity. Education produces and reproduces inequalities, but education, on the other hand, is a means to overcome these inequalities and disparities. So we have to think dialectically always. So we have a pessimistic side, okay, but I think we as the educators can use this chance still to, develop some optimistic imaginary. What I mean by this, we still think in national terms, but we witness that, students witness that virus does not recognize national borders. Okay, so we are more interdependent on each other, global. So we have to underline the importance of global citizenship, multiple belongings, cosmopolitan citizenship. So we need to, question our traditional, forms of belongings and citizenship. I know many of us are working on critical thinking, but in Teachers Network, when we are working on critical thinking, we also emphasize caring thinking and hopeful thinking. Caring thinking means we are responsible from each other. Children see that, witness that, for instance, quote unquote, developed countries reserve vaccine for themselves. But we cannot overcome the pandemic if we do not help us each other. Okay, so we have to care each other, and we have to develop a hopeful imaginary, living together, overcoming together, the pandemic. So this is, I think, we still have to be optimistic. What else can we do? In such a life. That's my vision, Fulden, about the near future of education.
Thank you. I wrote down we are responsible for each other in capital letters. It was really important to remember this. Mr. Shirin?
I am also optimistic. If you look at the data from Pew Charitable Trust that collects data from all over the world, including Turkey, actually, if you look at people young people under age 30, they ask them, what is the most important problem facing you, wherever you live in, either in Turkey, in Greece, or Brazil, wherever you pick. Under age 30, the problems that people, young people mention are two. Inequality, both at the global and within the nations, as well as global warming. I think with pandemic, the sense that we all live in the same earth, that sense of shared experience really sit in very nicely for this generation. That's why I feel like the notions that generation Z, X, Y, those are fancy terms, but they mean nothing to me. But the sense that COVID-19 put all these young people who are in their teen years or early years into the same experience, I think will shape their identity going forward. So I'm optimistic.
Thank you. Can we hear, Joelle, your last words from you tonight?
I agree with Professor Sharon in that COVID-19, the pandemic, has united the world's youth together in a common experience. And the one thing we've seen through technology, they've found ways to build community and share experiences. A poet laureate from the United States, Maya Angelou, wrote a poem called The Human Family. And I just wanted to take a moment. She says, nearing the end of her poem, in minor ways, we are different. In major ways, we are the same. And she goes on at the end to say, we are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. And I believe that conversations like this amongst teaching professionals, industry professionals, students, young people, world leaders alike will, if we allow it, will leave us in a better place than where we started in the pandemic. And so I'm excited to be involved in conversations like this with other educators where I hear so many similarities than I hear differences. So thank you for today.
Thank you. Ijan Kavaklar.
Using what we've learned during the pandemic about the power of relationships, innovative instructional models, and community partnerships, schools can be more equitable for all students. As schools reopen, traditional competencies will require some forms of upskilling or reskilling about classroom management or instructional design. For instance, we will have to focus on models for small group instructions, no contact collaborative exercises, differentiation tactics, and strategies to address learning gaps, using of virtual instruction software and digital formative assessment tools. Something very important was highlighted at a conference I attended by the teachers from all over the world. They said, no education system can outperform the quality of its teachers. Education systems, more than ever, require effective teachers that facilitate and support learning instead of delivering content, that use a combination of in-person and digital methods to deliver lessons that foster creative thinking, communication, and collaboration. And we need to use technology wisely to improve teaching and learning. It will be really challenging, maybe sometimes exhausting, but as a role model teacher, Rita Pearson said in her TED Talk, we are educators, we want to make a difference. We are, and we will be trying our absolute best. Thank you.
Thank you. We listen Professor Kenan Çayır, Professor Selçuk Şirin, Joelle Mcintosh, and Ijan Kavaklar today. All of our panelists introduced their unique perspectives on education systems and their responsiveness to the pandemic. We have addressed the inequalities affecting access to education. We have as well discovered a variety of creative solutions teachers have developed to overcome the obstacles they have encountered. And albeit the challenges and hardships, I believe we were all inspired by our panelists' stories and their comments, and leave this panel with strength to create change towards a better future. I'd like to thank Andrea and the US Consulate General for their efforts in bringing us here and creating an amazing opportunity for us educators to share Turkish and American perspectives and learn from each other. I also want to thank you attendees for joining us and hope you have all enjoyed today's delicate discussions. We will continue to think upon the new normal of the post-pandemic education, and to fill you in with what is next with this set of events, I would like to pass on to Andrea Knowles.
Thank you so much, Fulden, and thank you all for joining this wonderful discussion. Thank you so much to our panelists. I want to say thank you, especially for you all to all of you for offering your time, your perspective, your expertise. Thank you for your insightful questions and moderation, Fulden. Before everyone goes, I would like to remind you that we will be holding a roundtable discussion on June 5th to bring teachers across borders together to discuss their own experiences of teaching during the pandemic. I have copied your questions from the Q&A box to be considered there. And you may register your interest for that conversation via the link provided in the chat box. I hope to see some of you there. Thank you once again to everyone, and I wish you a very peaceful evening.